In the beginning, there was a garden, yet not the one painted in Sunday school murals. It was a realm of light and shadow where language was still being invented and humanity stood between obedience and awakening. For millennia, the story of Eden has shaped our sense of guilt, desire, and destiny. But what if the real story was never about apples or snakes? What if Eden was a mirror, a coded memory of the first human consciousness, written in poetry and preserved in scripture? Tonight, we open the oldest text on earth, not to worship its symbols but to read them as history, to follow the trail from ancient Mesopotamian hymns to the Hebrew Genesis, from temple carvings to lost apocrypha. This is not myth. This is the investigation of how the Garden of Eden became humanity's most enduring truth and its most dangerous story. To understand the Garden of Eden, we must first travel backward through time, past the centuries of interpretation, past the Gothic cathedrals and Byzantine mosaics, past even the Hebrew scribes who first committed these words to parchment. We must journey to the land between two rivers, to ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE, where the air was thick with incense and the ground fertile with stories. In this world, before Genesis was written, before the Hebrew people had even coalesced into a nation, the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians were already wrestling with the fundamental questions of existence. How did the world begin? Why do humans suffer? What is our relationship to the divine? Their answers came not in philosophical treatises, but in epic poems, hymns carved into clay tablets, and oral traditions passed from temple priest to temple priest. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, opens with a cosmos emerging from primordial chaos. Apsu, the freshwater abyss, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingle their waters to give birth to the first gods. But this is not a peaceful creation. The younger gods are too noisy, disturbing Apsu's rest. He plans to destroy them. The god Ea learns of this plot and kills Apsu first. From this violent beginning, the world takes shape not through loving intention, but through conflict and blood. Marduk, the young warrior god, eventually slays Tiamat, splitting her body in half to create heaven and earth. Humanity is formed from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's consort, mixed with clay, created specifically to serve the gods, to perform the labour the deities no longer wish to bear. This is the cosmological landscape that surrounded the Hebrew people. The Atrahasis epic tells a similar story, where humans are fashioned from clay and divine blood to relieve the gods of agricultural toil. The junior deities had been digging irrigation canals for 40 years, and in their exhaustion and rebellion, they went on strike. The solution? Create humanity as a worker class, beings of lesser status whose purpose is service. But there was another tradition, older and more mysterious. The Sumerians spoke of a place called Dilmun, a pristine land where no sickness existed, where predator and prey drank from the same waters, where the lion did not kill and the wolf did not snatch lambs. In one poem, the goddess Ninhursag creates a garden paradise for the god Enki. 8 plants grow there, beautiful and forbidden. Enki, driven by curiosity, eats them all. Ninhursag curses him with death, and 8 parts of his body begin to fail. Only through intervention and the creation of 8 healing goddesses is Enki saved. One of these goddesses is named Ninti, a name that can be translated as both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. These are the stories that filled the air when the Hebrew scribes began to write. Genesis did not emerge from a vacuum. It was composed within a world saturated with creation myths, flood narratives, and paradise legends. But the Hebrew version would be different. Where the Babylonian cosmos was born from violence, the Hebrew God would speak the world into existence through words alone. Where humans were created as slave labour, the Hebrew human would be formed in the divine image. Where the gods were capricious and petty, the Hebrew God would be singular and transcendent and moral. The Garden of Eden is not a rejection of Mesopotamian mythology, it is a transformation of it. The Hebrew scribes took the raw materials of their surrounding cultures and forged something new. They were writing theology as much as history, crafting an origin story that would define their people's unique identity. Eden was their answer to Babylon, their vision of how the world should have been before everything went wrong. The book of Genesis, as we know it today, is not the work of a single author writing in a single moment. It is a tapestry woven from multiple sources, edited and compiled over centuries. Modern biblical scholarship has identified at least 4 distinct traditions interwoven throughout the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The oldest strands are attributed to the Yahwist source, traditionally dated to around the 10th century BCE during the reign of Solomon, though some scholars place it later. This source uses the divine name YHWH, Yahweh, from the very beginning, and presents God in anthropomorphic terms. Yahweh walks in the garden, forms Adam from dust with divine hands, breathes life into human nostrils. This is the God of Genesis chapter 2, intimate and physical in relationship with creation. The Elohist source, dating perhaps to the 9th century BCE in the northern kingdom of Israel, refers to God as Elohim and presents a more distant, transcendent deity who communicates through dreams and messengers rather than direct encounter. Though the Elohist material is less prominent in the Eden narrative, it contributes to the broader theological framework of Genesis. The priestly source, written during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, gives us the majestic, orderly creation account of Genesis chapter 1. Here God speaks creation into existence through divine decree. Let there be light. Let the waters swarm with living creatures. This is liturgical prose, structured with the rhythm of temple ritual, emphasizing cosmic order, Sabbath rest, and the establishment of sacred time. Finally, the Deuteronomistic source emphasizes covenant, law, and the conditional nature of divine blessing. While less present in the garden narrative specifically, this tradition shapes the broader context of Israel's self-understanding. These sources were compiled and edited by scribes, likely during the post-exilic period when the Jewish people were returning from Babylon to Jerusalem. The exile had been catastrophic. The temple destroyed, the monarchy ended, the people scattered. The question facing them was existential. Who are we? How do we maintain our identity as a people when everything that defined us has been taken away? The answer lay in texts. The scribes gathered the oral traditions, the ancient manuscripts, the competing versions of their people's story, and wove them into a coherent narrative. They were not concerned with modern notions of historical accuracy or scientific precision. They were theologians and poets, working to preserve the memory of their people and to articulate their unique understanding of the divine. When a scribe sat down to write, "In the beginning," he was not merely recording history. He was making a theological claim that Israel's God, unlike the gods of Babylon, created through wisdom rather than violence. That humanity, unlike the Babylonian creation stories suggested, was not an afterthought or slave race, but the pinnacle of creation formed in the divine image. That the world was fundamentally good, ordered, purposeful. The political and spiritual motivations were inseparable. A people in exile needed to remember they had once dwelt in paradise. A people rebuilding their nation needed to articulate what had been lost and what might be regained. A people surrounded by foreign gods and foreign empires needed to assert their own identity, their own story, their own claim to divine favour. The scribe's hand, moving across parchment in the dim light of an oil lamp, was an act of resistance and hope. Each word was weighted with centuries of oral tradition. Each phrase was carefully chosen to echo and transform the myths of their conquerors. When he wrote of a garden in Eden, he was planting seeds that would grow for millennia. The word Eden itself is a puzzle wrapped in linguistic history. In Hebrew, Eden means delight or pleasure, and suggesting a place of joy and abundance. But scholars have traced possible earlier roots. The Sumerian word Edin referred to a steppe or plain, flat, open land. The Akkadian Edenu carried similar connotations of wilderness or uncultivated territory. If the Hebrew scribes were drawing on these older linguistic traditions, then the name itself contains a paradox. Eden is both cultivated garden and primordial plain, both ordered paradise and wild frontier. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, a translation known as the Septuagint, the translators faced a dilemma. How to render this Hebrew concept for a Greek-speaking audience? They chose the word paradisos, a term borrowed from Old Persian peridaesa, meaning an enclosed park or walled garden. The Persian kings had built elaborate pleasure gardens, irrigated oases within their palace complexes, where exotic plants and animals were displayed as symbols of royal power and control over nature. This translation choice fundamentally shaped how Western civilization would imagine Eden. No longer a steppe or plain, it became a garden, enclosed, cultivated, ordered. Paradise became synonymous with a specific kind of space, bounded, beautiful, protected from the wilderness beyond its walls. The word entered Latin as paradisus, and eventually into English as paradise, carrying with it layers of Persian imperial imagery, Greek philosophical concepts, and Hebrew theological meaning. But where was this place? Genesis provides geographic clues that seem tantalizingly specific. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides into 4 headwaters. The text names them: Pishon, which winds through the land of Havilah where there is gold; Gihon, which winds through the land of Cush; the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria; and the Euphrates. 2 of these rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, are easily identifiable. They are the great rivers of Mesopotamia, flowing through what is now Iraq. This has led many scholars to place Eden somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf, where these rivers come closest to each other. Archaeological evidence shows that in ancient times this region was indeed fertile, lush, and heavily irrigated, a true garden in comparison to the surrounding desert. But the other 2 rivers are mysteries. The Pishon and Gihon cannot be definitively located. Some have suggested the Pishon might be the Wadi al-Batin, a dry riverbed in northern Arabia. Others propose it could refer to the Indus River or even the Nile. The Gihon has been associated with the Nile, with the Aras River in Armenia, with underground springs in Jerusalem. Truth is, we do not know. This geographic ambiguity has led to 2 interpretative traditions. One approach treats Eden as a real place, somewhere in historical geography that might theoretically be located if we had enough information. This tradition has spawned centuries of expeditions, theories, and claims. Explorers have searched for Eden in Armenia, in Iraq, in East Africa, in the Americas. Each age projects Eden onto its own expanding map. The other approach treats Eden as symbolic geography, a mythic space that exists outside normal coordinates. Eden is not north or south, east or west. It is before, it is elsewhere. It is the space of origins that cannot be accessed through normal travel, because it exists in a different category of reality altogether. Perhaps both approaches miss the deeper point. Eden may be both place and symbol, both historical memory and theological imagination. The Hebrew scribes may have known real gardens in Mesopotamia, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the royal parks, the irrigated oases that made civilization possible in the desert. They encoded these real experiences into their text, but they also used this imagery to speak about something beyond geography, the state of original harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine. The act of translation itself, from Sumerian plain to Hebrew delight to Greek paradise, shows us how meaning shifts and accumulates. Each language carries its own cultural assumptions about what paradise means. Each translation makes choices that shape interpretation for centuries to come. We cannot access an original, pure meaning of Eden. We can only trace the layers, understanding that the story has always been told from within particular contexts, addressing particular questions, meeting particular needs. Eden is where language itself begins to form. It is the birthplace not only of humanity but of human speech, human naming, human meaning-making. Before the garden, there is only divine declaration. In the garden, Adam names the animals, speaks to Eve, converses with God. Paradise is the place where humans first become linguistic beings, where the gap between experience and expression first opens. And perhaps that is the deepest translation of all, from wordless existence to the world mediated by language, from pure being to the human condition of speaking about being. The creation of humanity in Genesis chapter 2 is described with extraordinary intimacy. The Hebrew text reads, YHWH Elohim formed the Adam from the dust of the Adamah. The wordplay here is crucial and largely untranslatable. Adam is not initially a proper name but a generic term for human being related to Adamah, meaning ground or earth. The human is earth being, ground creature, formed from the same substance as the soil itself. The verb formed, yatsar, is the same word used for a potter working clay, suggesting divine hands shaping and moulding. This is not the distant, transcendent creation of Genesis 1, where God speaks and it is so. This is tactile, physical craftwork. God as artist, as sculptor, working with raw material. The parallel with Mesopotamian creation myths is striking and deliberate. In the Atrahasis epic, the god Enki and the birth goddess Nintu create humans by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god. The goddess kneads the clay with divine fluid, and from this mixture, humanity emerges. Similarly, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wild man Enkidu is created by the goddess Aruru, who pinches off clay and throws it into the wilderness. But the Hebrew account transforms this motif. There is no divine blood mixed with clay, no slaughtered deity providing the raw material. The earth itself is sufficient, and it is made sacred by divine touch rather than divine sacrifice. The violence inherent in the Babylonian cosmology is removed. Creation becomes an act of care rather than conquest. Then comes the crucial moment. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. The Hebrew word for breath is neshama, closely related to neshama, soul, spirit, the animating principle of life. This divine breath transforms dust into being, matter into consciousness, clay into a living soul. This image, God's breath entering human nostrils, is unparalleled in ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. It suggests an intimacy and immediacy of relationship between divine and human. The breath that speaks worlds into existence now animates the human from within. We are literally inspired, filled with the Spirit. The divine is not distant, but as close as our own breathing, the inhale and exhale that sustains us moment by moment. This creates a profound paradox at the heart of human nature. We are dust, temporary mortal, bound to earth. But we are also divine breath, spiritual, transcendent, connected to eternity. We are creatures of radical dependence, formed from nothing, sustained by a breath that is not our own. Yet we are also creatures of dignity and freedom, bearing within us something of the divine nature itself. The phrase image of God, imago Dei, comes from Genesis 1:27 rather than the creation account in chapter 2, but it illuminates the same reality. To be created in the divine image does not mean physical resemblance. The Hebrew God has no body, no form. It means functional and relational resemblance. Just as ancient kings would set up images of themselves in distant provinces to represent their rule, so humans represent God on earth. We are created to be vice-regents, stewards, the divine presence in embodied form. This is a revolutionary concept in the ancient world. In Mesopotamian thought, only kings were images of the gods. The masses were created for service, not for ruling. But in Genesis, every human being, male and female, rich and poor, bears the divine image. Every person has inherent dignity, not because of social status or achievement, but because of the breath they carry, the dust they inhabit, the image they bear. The body is not a prison for the soul, not something to be transcended or escaped. Matter is not inferior to spirit. The dust is chosen, shaped, sanctified by divine touch. This will have profound implications throughout Jewish and Christian thought. The material world matters because God chose to work with it, to fashion from it beings capable of relationship with the divine. The paradox deepens when we consider freedom and dependence together. The human is entirely dependent. Without divine breath, we are merely dust. We do not create ourselves. We do not sustain ourselves. At every moment, we are upheld by a power beyond us. And yet we are free. God creates beings capable of choice, of moral reasoning, of relationship that is not coerced, but offered and received. The divine could have created automatons, perfectly obedient and perfectly predictable. Instead, God creates creatures who can even choose against their creator. This is the great risk of creation. Love that is forced is not love at all. Relationship that is compelled is not relationship but control. For humanity to be truly human, to be capable of authentic response to the divine, we must be free. And freedom means the possibility of failure, of falling, of choosing something other than the good. The dust and the breath, this is who we are. Mortal and immortal, bound and free, dependent and autonomous. We stand at the threshold between earth and heaven, between the animal and the divine, between necessity and possibility. The creation of humanity is not just the beginning of human history, it is the opening of a space of profound ambiguity. where the highest potential and the deepest vulnerability coexist in the same fragile, breathing, earthborn being. At the center of the garden stand two trees, and they are not the same. The first is the tree of life, offering immortality to those who eat its fruit. The second is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, explicitly forbidden, its fruit carrying the sentence of death. These two trees define the geography and theology of Eden. They establish the possibilities and limits of human existence. The tree of life appears throughout ancient Near Eastern iconography and mythology. In Mesopotamian art, we find stylized sacred trees flanked by guardian figures or divine attendants. These trees represented the axis mundi, the center of the world, the point where heaven and earth connect. To eat from such a tree was to partake of divine vitality, to transcend the normal limits of mortal existence. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero searches desperately for immortality after the death of his friend Enki forces him to confront his own mortality. He travels to the ends of the earth, crosses the waters of death, and finally obtains a plant of rejuvenation from the ocean floor. But on his journey home, a serpent steals the plant while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, shedding its skin and gaining renewed life while the hero remains mortal. The parallel with Genesis is provocative. A serpent, a plant that confers life, a human who loses access to immortality. But Genesis adds a second tree, and this is where the story becomes uniquely Hebraic. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents something more complex than simple immortality. It represents moral autonomy, the capacity to determine for oneself what is right and wrong, good and evil, beneficial and harmful. In the ancient world, wisdom literature often spoke of knowledge of good and evil as a defining characteristic of gods and kings. To know good and evil meant to exercise sovereign judgment, to stand in the place of ultimate moral authority. God's command is clear and absolute. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall die. This is the first divine prohibition, the first boundary established in human experience. Everything else in the garden is available, accessible, permitted. Only this one thing is forbidden. Why create such a tree at all? Why place it in the middle of the garden where it cannot be avoided or ignored? These questions have troubled interpreters for millennia. If God did not want humans to eat from the tree, why not place it outside the garden entirely? Or better yet, not create it at all? The answer lies in the nature of moral agency. A being who cannot choose wrong cannot truly choose right. Goodness that has no alternative is not virtue, but programming. For humans to be capable of authentic relationship with God and authentic moral life, there must be the possibility of refusal, the option of disobedience. The forbidden tree is not a trap, but the condition of freedom. The tree is a boundary marker. Every society, every moral system establishes boundaries between the permitted and the forbidden. These boundaries define the community, protect its values, establish its identity. To cross the boundary is to step outside the established order, to challenge the authority that drew the line. The forbidden fruit represents not just a specific act, but the powerful human capacity to transgress, to rebel, to say no, even to the divine. In Babylonian myth, certain foods were reserved for the gods alone. Humans who tasted divine food would either die or become immortal, crossing the ontological boundary between mortal and divine. The flood hero Utnapishtim, in the Gilgamesh epic, becomes immortal after surviving the deluge and being granted divine status. But such transformation is rare, granted only by divine decree. Genesis places the question of boundaries at the very beginning of human existence. The trees represent two different kinds of divine prerogative, the prerogative over life, the tree of life, and the prerogative over moral knowledge, the tree of knowledge. Humans are created with neither. We are mortal, and we do not initially possess autonomous moral judgment. We are dependent on God for both life and guidance. The silence before the first bite is profound. In that moment, all of human potential hangs suspended. There is the possibility of eternal obedience, of a human race that never questions, never doubts, never reaches beyond what is given. There is also the possibility of the reaching, the questioning, the transgression that will define human history. The trees stand there day after day, forbidden and accessible, the choice not yet made. The tree of knowledge offers something that sounds noble. Knowledge, understanding, wisdom. These are good things in themselves. The Hebrew word for knowledge, da'at, implies intimate, experiential understanding, not mere intellectual information. To know good and evil is to have experienced both, to understand from the inside what each means and entails. It is to move from innocence to experience, from simplicity to complexity, from trust to judgment. But it is also to take something that was not offered, to cross a boundary that was clearly marked, to assert human autonomy against divine authority. The fruit is beautiful and desirable, appealing to the senses and promising wisdom. But it is forbidden. And in the space between desire and prohibition, between what we want and what we are permitted, the entire drama of human moral existence unfolds. The two trees remain at the centre, one representing the life we do not have, one representing the knowledge we are not meant to possess. They stand as permanent reminders of human limits, human dependence, human possibility. They mark the boundaries of Eden itself, defining what it means to live in paradise, to have everything except that which is explicitly withheld. To be free in all things except the one thing that is forbidden. Into the garden comes a new figure, the serpent. The Hebrew text introduces it with unsettling simplicity. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that Yahweh Elohim had made. The word translated as crafty, aram, can mean shrewd, cunning, clever, prudent. It is not inherently negative. Wisdom literature often praises the quality of being aram. It is the mark of someone who thinks carefully, who plans ahead, who is not naive. But the serpent's craftiness will be put to a particular use. It will question the divine command, reinterpret the prohibition, and offer an alternative vision of what obedience might mean, or whether obedience is even desirable. In the ancient Near East, serpents carried complex symbolic weight. They were creatures of the earth dwelling in holes and crevices, emerging from the underworld. They shed their skins and appeared to renew their lives, making them symbols of regeneration and healing. The bronze serpent that Moses will later erect in the wilderness, according to Numbers 21, brings healing to those who look upon it. The serpent was associated with wisdom, fertility, and the chthonic powers that governed life and death. Egyptian religion revered the cobra goddess Wadjet as a protector of pharaohs. Canaanite temples featured serpent imagery connected to fertility cults. In Mesopotamia, the Mushushu, a dragon-serpent hybrid, was associated with Marduk, the king of the gods. To encounter a serpent in ancient religious imagination was to encounter something numinous and dangerous, something that mediated between realms. The Hebrew word for serpent, nahash, shares its root with words meaning to hiss, but also with words meaning to shine, or to practice divination. Some scholars have suggested the serpent may originally have been conceived as a shining, luminous being, rather than merely a snake. This would align with later interpretations that identified the serpent with a fallen divine being, though Genesis itself makes no such identification. Here, the serpent is simply one of the wild animals, distinguished only by its exceptional craftiness. The serpent's first words are a question. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? This is not an accurate quotation. God permitted eating from every tree except one, but the serpent's misrepresentation serves a rhetorical purpose. It makes the divine command seem unreasonable, restrictive, arbitrary. It plants doubt not about a specific prohibition, but about God's generosity and trustworthiness. Eve corrects the serpent, but her own response is revealing. She says they may eat from the trees, but God said, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." The addition of "neither shall you touch it" goes beyond what God actually said. Eve has expanded the prohibition, built a fence around the law. Whether this reflects her own caution or represents a command given by Adam, the text does not say, but the addition is significant. The boundary has already been reinterpreted, made more stringent than the divine word specified. Now the serpent makes its move. You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This is the heart of the temptation. The serpent does not deny that eating the fruit will have consequences. It reframes those consequences as positive. Your eyes will be opened. You will see, understand, comprehend what is currently hidden. You will be like God, elevated, empowered, autonomous. You will know good and evil, possess moral wisdom, make your own judgments, stand as your own authority. Each element of this promise is true in its way. When they eat, their eyes will be opened. They will become like God in knowing good and evil. God will explicitly confirm this later. The serpent tells the truth, but it is truth shaped toward a particular end, truth used as manipulation, truth that conceals as much as it reveals. What the serpent does not mention is the cost. Yes, their eyes will be opened, but what they will first see is their own nakedness, their vulnerability, their shame. Yes, they will know good and evil, but knowledge will come through the experience of guilt and alienation. Yes, they will become like God in one narrow sense, but they will simultaneously discover the immense distance between themselves and the divine, the gap that their presumption has now widened into a chasm. The serpent's temptation works on multiple levels. It appeals to the desire for wisdom, which is itself good. It promises elevation and equality with the divine, which speaks to human aspiration. It suggests that God is withholding something beneficial, which introduces suspicion into the divine-human relationship. And it reframes obedience as naivety, as missing out, as settling for less than what might be achieved. This is not brute temptation, lust, rage, obvious evil. This is subtle, sophisticated, rational. The serpent makes eating the fruit seem like the wise choice, the enlightened choice, the choice of someone who thinks for themselves rather than blindly following commands. The temptation is to transcendence, to knowledge, to becoming more than what one is. These are not base desires. They are among the highest human aspirations, and that's precisely what makes the temptation so powerful and so dangerous. In later Jewish tradition, the serpent would be identified with Satan, with the devil, with cosmic evil personified. But Genesis makes no such identification. The serpent is a creature, crafty and articulate, but still a creature within God's creation. The text does not explain where the serpent's opposition to the divine command comes from, or what motivates its intervention. It simply appears, speaks, and disappears from the narrative after God's judgment. The serpent's ambiguity is part of its power. It raises questions the text does not answer. What we see in this encounter is the birth of hermeneutics, the interpretation and reinterpretation of divine words. God said one thing. The serpent offers a different reading, a different understanding of what those words mean and what they imply about God's intentions. Eve must now choose between interpretations, between the straightforward reading of the command and the suspicious reading that suggests hidden motives. The conversation between Eve and the serpent is the first theological debate, the first moment when humans must adjudicate between competing claims about the divine. And in this adjudication, everything is at stake. The choice is not merely about fruit. It is about whom to trust, how to read divine intention, whether to accept limits or transcend them, whether to remain in dependent harmony or reach for autonomous knowledge. The silence before the first bite stretches out. The fruit hangs there, beautiful and forbidden, deadly and enlightening, dangerous and desirable. All of human history waits in that moment, the moment before the question is answered, before the choice is made, before the boundary is crossed. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. This simple sentence marks one of the most profound transitions in human consciousness described in any literature. The Hebrew phrase pakach ayin, to open the eyes, means more than physical sight. It indicates perception, understanding, awareness that was previously absent. Adam and Eve do not gain new eyes. They gain new seeing. What does it mean that their eyes were opened? They could see before, they saw the trees, the animals, each other, God walking in the garden. But now they see differently. They see themselves as objects of potential judgment. They see their vulnerability, their exposure, their lack of inherent protection. Most significantly, they see themselves as separate beings, distinct from each other and from their environment, capable of being observed and evaluated. This is the birth of self-consciousness in the fullest sense. Before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve existed in a state often described as pre-reflective awareness. They were conscious, certainly. They could speak and name animals, respond to God. But they had not yet turned consciousness back upon itself. They had not yet become aware of their own awareness, had not yet experienced the divide between observer and observed, between self and other, between inner experience and outer appearance. The knowledge of good and evil is not primarily intellectual information. It is experiential, participatory knowledge. They now know evil because they have done evil. They have transgressed the command. They now know good because they recognize what they have lost, what they have violated. The knowledge is in their bodies, in their shame, in the sudden self-awareness that makes them want to hide. The immediate response is to cover themselves. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. This is the first human technology, the first crafting of material to meet a need. But the need itself is new. Nakedness was not a problem before. Genesis explicitly says in chapter 2 that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Nakedness and shame are not naturally connected. Shame is the product of knowledge, the consequence of a particular kind of consciousness. The psychological depth here is remarkable. Shame is the emotion that arises when we are exposed in our vulnerability, when we are seen in a way we do not want to be seen, when the gap between who we are and who we wish to be becomes visible to others, or to ourselves. Shame is fundamentally about the gaze, about being looked at and found lacking. In shame, we want to disappear, to hide, to cover what has been exposed. Adam and Eve's shame is the recognition of their guilt, but it is more than that. It is the discovery of separateness, of otherness. They are suddenly aware of themselves as vulnerable bodies in space, as beings who can be observed, judged, found wanting. The innocence of their previous nakedness was the innocence of non-dual consciousness, where self and other had not yet fully separated. Now they are individuals, separate beings who must manage how they appear, who must protect themselves from the gaze of the other. This mirrors the myth of the cave in Plato's Republic, where prisoners who have only seen shadows on a wall are freed and exposed to sunlight. The light is painful, the revelation is disorienting. What was hidden is now visible, but visibility itself becomes a burden. Knowledge in both narratives is inseparable from pain. To see truly is to see what cannot be unseen, to know what cannot be unknown. But there is something profound happening beyond the psychological. The eating of the fruit represents humanity's leap into moral agency. Before there was obedience or disobedience, command and response. Now there is conscience, the internal sense of right and wrong, the capacity to judge one's own actions, the burden and gift of moral self-evaluation. Conscience is painful, it divides us against ourselves. We become simultaneously actor and judge, perpetrator and prosecutor. We lose the simple unity of pre-moral existence. In the Christian tradition, this moment will be interpreted through the lens of the original sin, the fall that corrupts all subsequent human nature. Augustine will argue that the sin of Adam and Eve is transmitted to all their descendants, that every human is born already guilty, already alienated from God. The Eastern Orthodox tradition will soften this somewhat, speaking of ancestral sin, not inherited guilt, but inherited consequences, the mortality and tendency towards sin that we all share. But at this moment in the Genesis narrative, before theology has systematized the story, what we have is simpler and more mysterious, a transformation in human consciousness. Adam and Eve are the same beings physically, but internally they have crossed a threshold. They have moved from innocence to experience, from trust to suspicion, from unity to division. They have gained knowledge and lost peace. They have become moral agents and lost moral simplicity. The opened eyes see nakedness, see vulnerability, see separation. But they also see possibility, the possibility of choice, of creativity, of making meaning in a world that is no longer simply given but must be interpreted and navigated. The knowledge of good and evil is terrible and necessary. It is the condition of human existence as we know it, the burden of consciousness, the weight of moral responsibility, the pain and grandeur of being creatures who must choose who we will become. The fruit has been eaten, the eyes have been opened, there is no going back. What lies ahead is exile and toil, pain and mortality, but also civilization and art, science and ethics, poetry and prayer. The knowledge they have gained will shape everything that follows. They are no longer innocent. They are for the first time fully human. They heard the sound of Yikvich Elohim walking in the garden in the cool of the day. The image is striking in its anthropomorphism. God walks, and the walking makes sound. God appears at a particular time, the cool of the day, the evening breeze when temperature drops and relief comes from the heat. This is the intimate, embodied God of the Yahwist source, the God who forms humans with divine hands and breathes into human nostrils. This is not the transcendent deity of Genesis 1, but a God who enters space and time, who has regular habits, who comes to the garden for companionship. But now for the first time, Adam and Eve hide. The man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yeshua Elohim among the trees of the garden. The relationship has been ruptured. Previously, God's approach would presumably have been welcomed, anticipated. They would have come forward eagerly to speak with their Creator. Now they hide, seeking darkness and concealment, pressing themselves among the foliage, hoping to avoid detection. The irony is profound. They are hiding from the one who made them, who knows them completely, who formed them from dust and breathed life into them. But this is what shame does. It makes us irrational, makes us attempt the impossible, makes us act as though we can somehow disappear from the gaze that constitutes us. Then comes the question, where are you? In Hebrew, ayeka, a simple devastating query. Many interpreters have puzzled over this question. Surely God, who is omniscient and omnipresent, knows where Adam is. Surely the divine search is not limited by trees and shadows, so the question must be rhetorical or pedagogical or relational rather than informational. Where are you is not a request for geographic coordinates. It is an invitation to self-reflection, to admission, to relationship. It is God giving Adam the opportunity to reveal himself, to step out from hiding, to speak the truth of what has happened. The question respects human agency even in this moment of crisis. God does not simply announce the transgression and pronounce judgment. God asks. God waits for response. God opens the possibility of confession. Adam's answer is telling. I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. He admits three things: hearing, fear, and nakedness. The hearing suggests that God's presence, once welcome, is now threatening. The fear is new. Before there was no reason for fear, no consciousness of wrongdoing or judgment. The nakedness is suddenly a problem, suddenly something shameful that must be concealed. But Adam does not yet confess. He explains his hiding without acknowledging why nakedness has become problematic, without naming the disobedience that has changed everything. God asks another question. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? The first question probes the source of shame. Who told you? Where did this new awareness come from? The implication is clear. Shame is not native to the human condition as created. It has been introduced, learned, acquired. Something has happened to make nakedness shameful. The second question is more direct, though still not an accusation. The interrogative form allows Adam to confess rather than simply being condemned. But it also narrows the possibilities. The shame, the hiding, the fear, all point to a specific cause. The question presses Adam toward honesty. What follows is one of the most human moments in Scripture. Adam responds, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate." In a single sentence, Adam manages to blame both Eve and God. The woman, not Eve, not my wife, but the woman, distancing language. Whom you gave to be with me, an implied complaint that God's gift has now become the source of problems. She gave me fruit. She is the actor. I am merely the passive recipient. And I ate, an admission, finally, but only after shifting responsibility away from himself. God turns to Eve. What is this that you have done? And Eve follows Adam's pattern. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. The serpent is blamed. The verb deceived, bahishiani, suggests she was tricked, manipulated, not fully responsible for her own choice, but she, like Adam, concludes with an admission. And I ate. This cascade of blame, Adam blaming Eve and God, Eve blaming the serpent, reveals something essential about human psychology in the face of shame and judgment. We distance ourselves from our actions. We find others to share or shoulder the responsibility. We construct narratives in which we are victims rather than perpetrators, passive rather than active, deceived rather than choosing. But notice what God does not do. God does not accept these explanations as excuses. The judgments that follow hold each party accountable for their role. The serpent is cursed for its deception. Eve will experience pain in childbirth and struggle in relationship with her husband. Adam will experience toil in his work and eventual return to dust. Each has acted, and each will bear consequences. The divine omniscience feigned in the questioning serves a purpose. It gives Adam and Eve the dignity of response, the opportunity to speak their own truth, however inadequate. God already knows what happened. The narrative makes this clear. But God asks anyway, creating space for confession, for relationship, for the acknowledgement that must precede any restoration. Where are you? The question echoes beyond Eden. It is the perpetual divine question to humanity. Where are you in relation to me? Where are you in relation to your own choices? Where are you in the moral landscape of your life? The question is not about location, but about location in the fullest sense. Where we stand, who we have become, how we have positioned ourselves in relation to the good. And the hiding continues. We hide behind explanations, behind blame, behind rationalizations. We hide among the trees of whatever garden we find ourselves in, hoping the voice will pass, hoping the question will not require an answer. But the voice keeps calling. Where are you? The relationship has been ruptured, but it is not yet ended. The question itself is a form of grace, the divine still seeking, still calling, still wanting to know where we are. The judgments come in order. First the serpent, then Eve, then Adam. Each judgment is specific to the transgressor's role. Each establishes consequences that will define future existence. These are not arbitrary punishments, but the natural outworking of choices made, relationships broken, boundaries crossed. To the serpent, God says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." The curse transforms the serpent's status. It will crawl in dust, the lowest position, eating dirt as it moves. The imagery suggests complete degradation, but more significant is the enmity established between serpent and humanity. This is not merely natural animosity, but cosmic opposition. The offspring of the woman will strike at the serpent's head, a mortal blow. The serpent will strike at the human heel, painful but not fatal. In this pronouncement, interpreters have seen the first promise of redemption, the proto-evangelium or first gospel. A descendant of Eve will crush the serpent, will undo the damage done in this moment. To Eve, God says, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." The pain in childbearing is physical and immediate. The Hebrew word for pain, itzavon, can also mean toil or labour, the same word used for Adam's agricultural work. Childbirth will be excruciating, dangerous, life-threatening. The biological function most central to the continuation of human life will be marked by suffering. Every birth will recall the fall, will enact again the pain of mortality and the cost of knowledge. But the second part of the judgment is relational and structural. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. The word translated desire, teshuka, appears rarely in the Hebrew Bible. It can mean longing, craving, or perhaps seeking to control. The exact meaning is debated, but the point is clear. The relationship between man and woman will be marked by conflict, by struggle for dominance, by distortion of the mutuality that characterized their original unity. This is not a prescription, but a description. God is not commanding husbands to rule over wives. God is predicting the distortion that will enter gender relations because of the fall. The original unity, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, will give way to hierarchy, to dominance, to the painful structures that characterize fallen humanity. Every patriarchal system, every gendered violence, every inequality between men and women has its root herein in the fracturing of original harmony. To Adam, God says, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Adam's judgment is longer, more elaborate, touching multiple dimensions of existence. The ground itself is cursed, not Adam directly, but the earth from which he was taken and upon which he will depend. Agriculture will be difficult, painful, resistant. Thorns and thistles will grow, requiring constant labour to maintain any cultivation. The garden's easy abundance is replaced by the field's reluctant yield. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Work itself is not the curse. Adam was placed in the garden to work it and keep it before the fall, but now work will be toilsome, exhausting, a constant struggle against resistance. Survival will require relentless effort. The ease of gathering fruit from trees is replaced by the cycle of ploughing, planting, tending, harvesting, grinding, baking, the endless labour that defines agricultural civilization. And then the ultimate sentence, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Mortality is confirmed. The threatened death comes not immediately, but eventually, inexorably. The dust being will return to dust, the breath will cease, the animation will fade. Death enters human experience not as a natural transition, but as judgment, as loss, as the ultimate consequence of disobedience. This is the etiology of human suffering, the story of how things came to be the way they are. Why is childbirth painful? Why is agriculture difficult? Why do men and women struggle in relationship? Why do we die? Genesis answers, because something was broken, a boundary was crossed, and the consequences cascade through all of existence. But we must be careful here. The text itself does not contain the later Christian doctrine of original sin in its full Augustinian form. It does not say that Adam's guilt is transmitted to all descendants, that every human is born already condemned. What it does say is that Adam and Eve's choice initiated a pattern, established a reality that shapes all subsequent human existence. We are born into a world of toil and pain and mortality. We inherit not guilt but consequences. We live in the world after the fall. Some feminist interpreters have rightly protested the traditional readings that place primary blame on Eve and use Genesis 3 to justify the subordination of women. The text itself distributes responsibility more evenly. Both Adam and Eve chose to eat. Both face consequences. The rule of husbands over wives is presented as a consequence of sin, not as God's original design. To take fallen relationships as normative is to mistake description for prescription, to baptize the broken rather than seeking restoration. Moreover, the judgment on Eve mentions her offspring in a way that suggests hope. From her will come the one who crushes the serpent's head. The woman who was deceived will be the mother of redemption. This theme will echo throughout biblical narrative. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, Ruth, Mary. Women will play crucial roles in the unfolding of salvation history. Despite or perhaps because of the particular way the fall has distorted gender relations, the sentences are pronounced. The consequences are established. But the story is not over. Judgment is not the final word. Even in the curses, there are hints of redemption, seeds of hope. The serpent will be crushed. Children will be born. Bread will be eaten. Humanity will endure, will persist through pain and toil and mortality. And somewhere beyond the closed gate, the memory of the garden will remain, driving humans to seek, to yearn, to hope for restoration of what was lost. The final act in the garden comes swiftly. God makes garments of animal skin for Adam and Eve, covering their nakedness more permanently than the fig leaves could manage. This small act of care in the midst of judgment is remarkable. Even as God pronounces consequences and prepares to expel them from paradise, God attends to their vulnerability, ensures their basic covering. Grace and judgment intertwine. Then comes the divine deliberation. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat, and live forever. The sentence trails off, incomplete, but the implication is clear. Humans now possess one divine attribute, knowledge of good and evil. If they also gain immortality, they will become fully like God. This cannot be permitted. The us here has puzzled interpreters. Is it a royal plural, a majestic way of speaking? Is it God speaking to the divine council? The assembly of heavenly beings are mentioned in other biblical texts. Is it a remnant of polytheistic tradition, later edited but not completely erased? The text does not explain, leaving the plurality mysterious. What is clear is the urgency of preventing access to the tree of life. Throughout the garden narrative, this tree has been present but passive mentioned, but not emphasized. Now it becomes the crucial danger. Humans with moral knowledge and physical immortality would be gods indeed, not in image but in actuality. The creatures would become creators, the dependent would become autonomous, the boundary between divine and human would dissolve. Therefore Yahweh Elohim sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. The expulsion is immediate and absolute. The Hebrew word for sent out, shalach, can also mean divorced or dismissed. It suggests not just physical relocation, but relational rupture. Adam and Eve are not merely leaving, they are being driven out, banished, exiled from the place of their origin. The vocabulary of exile here resonates powerfully with the experience of the scribes writing this text. They had lived through the Babylonian conquest, the destruction of Jerusalem, the forced march to Babylon, the decades of displacement. They knew what it meant to lose homeland, to be separated from the place that defined identity, to long for return to what had been lost. In telling the story of Adam and Eve's exile from Eden, they were also telling their own story, encoding their own trauma into the mythic narrative. But there is a difference. Israel's exile in prophetic theology was punishment for specific sins that could be repented of, a temporary state that would eventually be reversed. God promised restoration, return, rebuilding. Adam and Eve's exile from Eden is permanent. The way back is blocked. The garden cannot be regained through repentance or good works or divine mercy. It is closed, finished, past. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. The cherubim are not the chubby baby angels of Renaissance art. They are powerful, awesome, terrifying divine beings, hybrid creatures with human faces, animal bodies and wings. In ancient Near Eastern art, similar figures guarded palace gates and temple entrances. They represented divine presence and power, the boundary between sacred and profane, the limit beyond which mortals could not pass. The flaming sword, literally, the flame of a sword turning itself, is a weapon of supernatural fire, constantly moving, impossible to evade or defeat. It ensures that no human, no matter how clever or determined, can re-enter the garden. The way to the tree of life is sealed. Immortality is beyond reach. Humanity will be mortal from this point forward, generation after generation born and dying, dust returning to dust. The psychological impact of expulsion cannot be overstated. Adam and Eve go from a place of abundance to a place of scarcity, from easy sustenance to difficult labour, from divine intimacy to divine distance. They go from being the centre of creation, the crown of God's work, to being refugees in a wilderness struggling to survive. The fall is not just moral but geographic, not just spiritual but material. And yet they go together. The text says, he drove out the man, but Eve goes with him. They face exile as a pair, as partners in transgression and consequence. In the world outside Eden, they will need each other more than ever. The companionship that God saw as essential, it is not good that the man should be alone, becomes the means of survival and continuity. They will have children, will build civilization, will pass on the story of what they lost. The footsteps fading into wilderness mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Behind them is paradise guarded and unreachable. Ahead is the world as we know it, the world of struggle and survival, beauty and brutality, creativity and destruction. The garden recedes into memory, into myth, into the realm of what can never be directly accessed but never quite forgotten. Exile is not just a physical state but an existential condition. We are all, in the logic of Genesis, exiles from Eden. We are all born outside the garden, into a world where thorns grow and bread requires sweat and mortality is certain. We carry within us the memory of harmony, or perhaps the intuition of what harmony might be, and the ache of its absence. We build gardens of our own, plant seeds, tend growth, trying to recreate in miniature what was lost in full. But our gardens are fragile, temporary, always requiring maintenance. The weeds return, the thorns grow back, the gate stays closed. The phrase east of Eden has become proverbial, suggesting exile, wandering, the place of those who are separated from blessing. The text says Cain, after killing Abel, went away from the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. East, the direction of expulsion, the direction away from the garden, the direction of increasing distance from the source. But first, there are children. Adam knows Eve, and she conceives and bears Cain. Her words at his birth are significant. I have gotten a man with the help of YHWH. Even in exile, the creative partnership continues. The command to be fruitful and multiply predates the fall. It remains in effect. Children are born outside paradise, but they are still born as image-bearers, still formed from dust and animated by divine breath. Then Abel is born, the second son. The text gives us almost no information about him except his occupation. He is a keeper of sheep, while Cain is a worker of the ground. Already the division of labour appears, the specialisation that will characterise civilised life. Agricultural and pastoral lifestyles exist side by side, representing different strategies for survival in the post-Eden world. The story of Cain and Abel's offerings is sparse but potent. Both bring offerings to YHWH, Cain from the fruit of the ground, Abel from the firstborn of his flock. God regards Abel's offering with favour but not Cain's. The text does not explain why. Traditional interpretation has suggested various reasons. Abel offered from the best of his flock while Cain did not offer first fruits. Abel offered in faith while Cain did not. The animal sacrifice was more acceptable than the vegetable offering. But Genesis itself is silent on the reason. What matters for the narrative is Cain's response. He becomes angry, dejected. His countenance falls. God asks him, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." This is the first explicit mention of sin, chata, in Genesis. It is personified as a predatory animal, crouching, waiting for opportunity to pounce. The verb crouching, roves, is the same used for a lion waiting, in ambush. Sin has desire, teshuka, the same word used for Eve's desire toward Adam in chapter 3. Sin wants to control Cain, to master him, but Cain must rule over it, must exercise the dominion that proves difficult yet necessary. Cain does not rule over it. Instead, he invites Abel into the field and kills him. The first human death is murder, brother killing brother, the violence that was absent from creation, that entered only with divine judgment after the fall, now erupts in human form. The first generation born outside Eden contains the first murderer. God's question to Cain echoes the question to Adam, "Where is Abel your brother?" Again, the question is not informational but relational, pedagogical. Cain responds with the infamous words, "I do not know, am I my brother's keeper?" The Hebrew word for keeper, shomer, is the same word used for Adam's task in the garden, to keep it, to guard it, to maintain it. Cain rejects the responsibility implied in relationship. He claims not to know, claims not to be responsible for his brother. But God knows. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Blood has voice. Murder speaks. The earth itself, cursed already because of Adam, is further polluted by innocent blood. Cain's punishment is exile within exile. He will become a wanderer, unable to farm successfully, perpetually restless. The ground will no longer yield to him. He is driven further from Eden, further from home, further from rootedness. Cain's response reveals his awareness of vulnerability. "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." He fears the cycle of violence he has initiated will turn against him. Blood demands blood, murder will breed murder. God places a mark on Cain, a sign of protection. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. This is not forgiveness. Cain still bears his punishment, but it is protection, a breaking of the cycle of retribution. Cain is allowed to live, to continue, to found a line of descendants. In a sense, God guards Cain the way the cherubim guard Eden, protecting what is damaged, preserving what is fallen, allowing continuity despite catastrophe. Cain builds a city, the first mentioned in Genesis. He names it after his son Enoch. This is the beginning of urban civilization, the gathering of humans into organized communities. Cain's descendants are credited with cultural innovations. Jabal is the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. Jubal is the father of those who play the lyre and pipe. Tubal-Cain is the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Music and metallurgy, arts and technology, all emerge from the line of Cain, from the murderer's offspring. This is deeply ambiguous. Civilization is born from violence, from exile, within exile, from the line of one who killed his brother. Human culture is both gift and curse, both achievement and compensation. We build cities because we are restless. We make music because we remember harmony lost. We forge metal because we need tools to survive in a world that resists us. Innovation is born from necessity, and necessity is born from fall. The theological anthropology here is profound. Humans are makers, builders, creators. We transform the environment, develop technologies, create art. This is part of bearing the divine image. We are creative beings because we are made by a creator. But our creativity is shaped by our fallenness. We build not only out of abundance, but out of lack, not only from joy, but from defense, not only to celebrate, but to compensate. The agricultural versus nomadic conflict in the Cain and Abel story reflects real historical tensions. Throughout ancient history, farmers and herders existed in tension, competing for resources, pursuing different lifestyles. The story validates neither absolutely, but shows the tragedy of their conflict. Both vocations are legitimate. Both offerings should be acceptable. But rivalry, jealousy, and violence disrupt what should be peaceful coexistence. The first altar mentioned in Genesis is Abel's offering place. The first city is Cain's construction. Worship and civilization emerge together in the aftermath of exile, twin responses to life outside paradise. We build altars because we long for connection with the divine from whom we are separated. We build cities because we need protection, cooperation, structure in a world that is no longer garden. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve continue. They have another son, Seth, born in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. Through Seth's line will come Noah, Abraham, the patriarchs, the people of Israel. The genealogy of grace runs parallel to the genealogy of civilization. Both lines descend from Eden. Both carry the image, both bear the burden and possibility of being human after the fall. The innovations continue. The text notes that in Seth's line, people began to call upon the name of YHWH. Prayer emerges, formal worship, religious practice as distinct activity. Outside Eden, humans must intentionally seek divine presence that was once immediate and natural. The relationship must be cultivated, maintained through ritual and discipline. East of Eden becomes the space of human history. It is the place of innovation born from guilt, civilization constructed in exile, worship offered across distance. It is where we live, where we have always lived, where we will continue to live until the gate reopens, if it ever does. The cherubim remain on guard, the sword keeps turning, and we remain outside, building to what we can, remembering what we lost. The cherubim stationed at Eden's eastern gate are more than mere divine sentries. They represent a category of being between human and divine, a class of creature that inhabits the threshold, mediating between realms. Understanding cherubim requires entering the visual and theological world of ancient Near Eastern religion. In Mesopotamian and Egyptian art, hybrid guardian figures were standard at palace and temple entrances. The Assyrian lamassu were massive sculptures, human-headed, winged bulls with 5 legs, giving the illusion of standing still from the front and walking from the side. These creatures protected sacred space, marking the boundary between common and holy, between accessible and forbidden. They were apotropaic figures, warding off evil and unauthorized entry through their imposing presence. The cherubim of biblical tradition share characteristics with these ancient guardians. In Ezekiel's visions, cherubim have 4 faces: human, lion, ox, eagle, representing the fullness of creaturely existence, the highest examples of humanity, wild animals, domesticated animals, and birds. They have wings, hands, wheels within wheels, movements that suggest supernatural mobility and power. They are the living throne of God, the creatures who uphold divine presence, who move with divine movement, who see with divine vision. In the tabernacle and later the Jerusalem temple, cherubim played a central architectural and theological role. The Ark of the Covenant was overshadowed by 2 golden cherubim, their wings touching above the mercy seat where God's presence would appear. The inner veil of the temple was embroidered with cherubim, depicting the guardians of sacred space. The Holy of Holies, entered only by the high priest on Yom Kippur, was guarded by these figures, marking it as the most sacred precinct, the earthly counterpart to the heavenly throne room. This is crucial. The temple was understood as a micro-Eden, a recreation in miniature of the original garden paradise. Just as Eden had been the place of divine presence, where God walked and humanity could encounter the holy without mediation, so the temple became the designated place of meeting. The cherubim guarding the Holy of Holies echoed the cherubim guarding the garden's entrance. The difference was that the temple could be entered, but only by authorized persons at authorized times, with authorized sacrifices. The gate was not entirely sealed. A way back to divine presence existed, but it was narrow, dangerous, mediated by priesthood and ritual. The 7-branched menorah in the temple has been interpreted as a stylized tree, possibly an echo of the tree of life that humanity could no longer access. The temple's bronze sea, the great basin for priestly washing, contained water, like the river that flowed from Eden to water the garden. The temple furnishings recreated paradise symbolically, allowing Israel to remember what was lost and to participate ritually in what could not be regained existentially. When Solomon dedicates the first temple in 1 Kings 8, his prayer acknowledges that even this magnificent structure cannot truly contain God. Behold heaven, and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet God condescends to meet humans there, to hear prayers directed towards this place, to maintain presence among the people. The temple is simultaneously a reminder of exile and provision for relationship despite exile. The return from Babylonian captivity centered on rebuilding the temple. The people had lost land, monarchy, and temple, the 3 pillars of their national identity. When they returned, the temple took priority because it represented the possibility of restored relationship with God. Without temple, they were truly exiled even in their own land. With temple, even a modest one, they had access to holiness, a way through the cherubim to the divine presence. But the prophets already saw beyond physical temple. Ezekiel's vision in chapters 40 to 48 describes a perfect, idealized temple that was never actually built, a symbolic structure representing ultimate restoration. Isaiah 6:6 records God saying, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me, and what is the place of my rest?" The prophetic tradition begins to spiritualize temple, to see it as metaphor rather than mere building. In Christian interpretation, this trajectory culminates in Jesus. He claims to be the temple. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Gospel of John interprets this as reference to his body. The place of meeting between God and humanity is no longer a building but a person. The cherubim are passed not by ritual but by faith. The way to the tree of life is opened through the cross, the tree of death that becomes the means of life. The book of Hebrews develops this extensively. Jesus is the great high priest who enters not an earthly holy of holies but the heavenly one, not with animal blood but with his own blood, not repeatedly but once for all. The veil of the temple is torn at the crucifixion, symbolizing that the barrier between divine and human has been removed. Access to God's presence is no longer limited to one place, one day, one person. The cherubim's guard is ended, or rather transformed. The way is open to all who come through Christ. But this is Christian reading, layered onto Genesis centuries after its composition. The original text leaves the cherubim on guard. The sword still turning, the way still blocked. Whatever hope exists for return to Eden is not explicit in these chapters. The gate is closed. Humanity builds imitations of paradise, temples, gardens, sacred spaces, but we cannot re-enter the original. We are, in her most fundamental sense, people of the outside, people of the exile, people who remember home but cannot return. The cherubim stand as permanent reminder of both loss and protection. We cannot return to innocence, cannot unknow what we have learned, cannot reverse the consciousness that opened our eyes, but neither can we achieve divinity, cannot grasp immortality through our own effort, cannot make ourselves gods through knowledge or power or achievement. The cherubim enforce the boundary, maintain the distinction, keep humanity human and divinity divine. And so we build our substitute gardens, our symbolic Edens, our sacred architectures. We erect temples and cathedrals, monasteries and shrines. We create gardens, carefully tended, walled off from wilderness. We paint paradise in mosaics and frescoes, write about it in poetry and prose, dream about it in our myths and prayers. We cannot go back, but we never stop trying to recreate what we dimly remember, what we have never actually experienced but somehow know we have lost. When the gates of geographic Eden closed, a new tradition began, the search for Eden within. If the outer garden was inaccessible, perhaps an inner garden remained. If paradise could not be reached through space, perhaps it could be accessed through spirit. This is the birth of mystical interpretation, the inward turn that transforms Eden from place to state, from geography to psychology, from history to allegory. Philo of Alexandria, the first-century Jewish philosopher, pioneered this approach. Steeped in both Hebrew scripture and Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism, Philo read Genesis allegorically. For him, Eden was not primarily a physical location but represented the soul. The garden was the life of virtue, cultivated by wisdom and watered by the four rivers of the cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Adam represented the human mind, Eve represented sensory perception, the serpent was pleasure that leads reason astray. The expulsion from Eden was the soul's fall from contemplation into materiality, from spiritual awareness into bodily distraction. This allegorical method would profoundly influence Christian interpretation. Origen, the 3rd century Alexandrian theologian, followed Philo's lead. He taught that Scripture has multiple levels of meaning: literal, moral, and spiritual. The literal Eden was real, but it pointed beyond itself to spiritual realities. The garden represented the church, or the soul in grace, or the state of contemplation. To seek Eden was to seek union with God through prayer, asceticism, and mystical experience. Augustine, while more grounded in literal interpretation than Origen, still saw Eden as having both historical and spiritual significance. The garden existed, Adam and Eve were real people, the fall actually happened. But these events also symbolized every person's spiritual journey. Each soul experiences its own fall, its own exile, its own need for redemption. Eden is both past event and present possibility. We can, through grace, experience restoration to the harmony Adam knew before sin. The monastic tradition took this seriously. Monks and nuns withdrew from the world, creating enclosed gardens, cloisters, courtyards, hermitages, where they sought to recreate Eden's conditions. Through poverty, chastity, and obedience, they attempted to reverse the fall, to re-establish right relationship with God through discipline and devotion. The monastery garden was sacred space carefully tended, offering beauty and sustenance, providing an environment for prayer and work in balance, a deliberate echo of Adam's role to work and keep the garden. Medieval mysticism developed elaborate gardens of the soul. The enclosed garden, hortus conclusus, became a metaphor for the Virgin Mary, for the Church, for the individual soul protected from worldly corruption. The Song of Songs, with its lush garden imagery, was read as allegory of Christ's relationship with the believer. A garden locked is my sister, my bride, a garden locked, a fountain sealed. The mystical tradition spoke of the soul as God's garden, to be cultivated through prayer, weeded of vice, watered with tears of repentance. Islamic mysticism developed similar themes. The Quran promises paradise, Jannah, literally garden, to the faithful, described with lush imagery of flowing rivers, abundant fruit, and eternal pleasure. But Sufi mystics look beyond literal paradise to the divine presence itself. The garden became metaphor for the heart that contains God's presence, the soul that has achieved fana, annihilation of ego, and baka, subsistence in God. Persian poets like Rumi used garden imagery extensively. The garden of the world has no limits, except in your mind. Buddhism, while not sharing the Eden myth specifically, developed the concept of the Pure Land, a paradise realm where conditions are perfect for achieving enlightenment. But deeper Buddhist teaching suggests that Pure Land is also a state of mind, a way of being in the world with awakened awareness. The external search for paradise and the internal cultivation of enlightened consciousness are not contradictory but complementary. Hindu tradition speaks of Satya Yuga, the golden age at the beginning of the cosmic cycle when Dharma was fully present, when humans lived in harmony with cosmic order, when there was no suffering or discord. This too can be understood both as historical epoch and as perpetual possibility, the state of consciousness available when we align with ultimate reality, when we realize our true nature beyond ego and illusion. The commonality across these traditions is striking. Paradise is simultaneously lost history and present possibility. We cannot return to innocence, but we can achieve integration. We cannot unknow good and evil, but we can transcend the dualities that fragment consciousness. We cannot re-enter the garden spatially, but we can discover sacred space within. The interior garden requires cultivation. In Christian mysticism, this meant lectio divina, sacred reading, contemplative prayer, examination of conscience, sacramental life. In Buddhist practice, it meant meditation, mindfulness, ethical conduct, study of teachings. In Islamic practice, it meant dhikr, remembrance of God, Quranic, recitation, surrender to divine will. The methods differ, but the direction is similar: inward, toward the centre, toward the still point where the divine can be encountered. Teresa of Avila described the soul as an interior castle with many rooms, moving from the outer courts of worldly distraction through deeper chambers of prayer until reaching the innermost room where God dwells and transforming union occurs. John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul, the necessary stripping away of false consolations and attachments, the purgation that precedes illumination. These mystical journeys are reverse exiles, movements from the outer wilderness back toward the interior garden where God can be met. But mystical traditions also warn against false paradises, spiritual bypassing, premature claims of enlightenment. The way inward is demanding, dangerous, requiring guidance and discernment. Not every inner experience is divine. Not every garden is Eden. The cherubim guard the interior gate as surely as they guarded the exterior one. Authentic transformation requires death to self, not just pleasant feelings or altered states. Modern psychology has engaged these traditions. Carl Jung wrote about individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the achievement of wholeness symbolized by mandalas and sacred enclosures. Abraham Maslow spoke of self-actualization, peak experiences, states of consciousness, where individuals feel connected to something larger than themselves. These psychological frameworks, while secular in language, echo the mystical quest for interior paradise. The Eden within is not escape from the world, but transformation of perception. It is learning to see the sacred in the ordinary, to recognize the divine presence that has never been absent but only veiled by our fragmented consciousness. The garden is not somewhere else, but here, hidden in plain sight, accessible not through geographical journey, but through awakening, through attention, through love. The mystics teach that paradise was never truly lost, only our ability to perceive it. The cherubim guard not to keep us out, but to protect the sacred from profanation, to ensure that entry requires purification, to maintain the boundary between casual tourism and genuine transformation. The flaming sword is the burning away of false self, of ego, of everything that blocks divine vision. To pass through is to be consumed and remade, and so the search inward continues. In prayer and meditation, in silence and solitude, in community and liturgy, humans seek the garden within. We plant seeds of virtue and pull weeds of vice. We water the soul with tears and discipline. We wait for fruit that may not ripen in this lifetime. But we trust that the garden exists, that paradise is not only past but also future, not only lost but also promised, not only memory but also hope. The story of Eden did not end with Genesis. Each generation, each tradition, each interpretation has rewritten the fall, finding new meanings, new emphases, new applications in the ancient text. The story became a mirror in which cultures and individuals saw themselves, their struggles, their questions about human nature and divine justice. Early Christianity transformed the Eden narrative through the lens of Christ. Paul's letters established the interpretive framework that would dominate Christian theology for centuries. In Romans 5, Paul writes, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned," and later, "For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. This is the doctrine of the second Adam. Christ is the new Adam who succeeds where the first Adam failed. Where Adam disobeyed and brought death, Christ obeys unto death and brings life. Where Adam's transgression caused exile, Christ's sacrifice enables return." The entire narrative of sin and redemption is structured around these two figures, these two moments, the fall and the restoration, the eating of forbidden fruit and the offering of the crucified body. Paul develops this further in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. "For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. The first manner, Adam became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. The parallels are deliberate and comprehensive. Adam is from earth, earthy. Christ is from heaven, heavenly. Adam brings death. Christ brings resurrection. The fall is not the end of the story, but the middle, the problem to which Christ is the solution. This interpretation gave Christian theology its fundamental shape. The human predicament is not primarily ignorance, as in Greek philosophy, or suffering, as in Buddhism, but sin, inherited guilt and corrupted nature passed from Adam to all descendants. The solution is not education or enlightenment, but redemption, grace, breaking into human history through the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, developed this theology into its most influential form. Against the Pelagians, who argued that humans retain free will and the ability to choose good without divine grace, Augustine insisted that the fall had fundamentally corrupted human nature. Original sin is transmitted from parents to children through procreation itself. Every human is born already guilty, already separated from God, unable to choose good without preventing grace. Concupiscence, disordered desire, the tendency towards sin, marks every human heart from conception. For Augustine, Eden represents the state of original righteousness, datus integritatis, that humanity has lost and cannot regain through any human effort. Adam before the fall possessed the ability not to sin, posse non pecere. After the fall, humanity possesses the inability not to sin, non posse non pecare. Only in the final resurrection will the blessed receive the inability to sin, non posse peccare, the final security of confirmed grace. This Augustinian framework shaped Western Christianity, both Catholic and later Protestant. The sacrament of baptism was understood as removing the stain of original sin, regenerating the soul, initiating the process of sanctification. The need for baptism, even of infants, derived from the doctrine that all are born guilty. Without baptism, even babies would face judgment for Adam's sin, inherited through their very nature. But Eastern Orthodox Christianity developed differently. While accepting the reality of the fall and its consequences, Eastern theologians generally rejected Augustine's notion of inherited guilt. They spoke instead of ancestral sin. We inherit the consequences of Adam's transgression, mortality, corruption, weakness, but not his personal guilt. Each person sins through their own choice, though in a context already corrupted by accumulated human sinfulness. For Eastern Christianity, the fall is primarily about losing communion with God, rather than acquiring legal guilt. The image of God in humanity is damaged, but not destroyed. Salvation is understood as theosis, deification, union with God, participation in divine nature, restoration to the fellowship that Adam knew. This is achieved through the incarnation of Christ, who united divine and human nature in his person, opening the way for humanity's transformation. The Western-Eastern split on original sin has profound implications. Western theology tends toward legal and juridical categories: guilt, innocence, justice, atonement, forensic justification. Eastern theology tends toward therapeutic and relational categories: sickness, healing, communion, restoration, transformative participation. Both traditions find these emphases in scripture and tradition, but they construct different theological systems from the same sources. Medieval art and literature explored Eden extensively. Dante's Divine Comedy structures the entire cosmos around the fall and redemption. Earthly paradise, Eden, is located at the summit of Mount Purgatory, where Dante meets Beatrice before ascending to the celestial spheres. The fall is the reason for purgatory and hell, and the whole elaborate structure of Christian cosmology. Countless medieval paintings depicted the fall, from manuscript illuminations to massive cathedral frescoes. Artists wrestled with how to portray the serpent as dragon, as human-headed snake, as beautiful woman, how to depict pre-fall nudity without indecency, how to show the moment of temptation, the eating, the shame, the expulsion. Each image is also interpretation, making choices about emphasis, about blame, about the nature of the transgression. The Protestant Reformation brought new emphasis on the fall. Luther's doctrine of total depravity insisted that sin has corrupted at every aspect of human nature: mind, will, emotions, body. Humans are not merely sick, but dead in sin, incapable of any movement toward God without the Holy Spirit's regenerating work. Calvin developed this into a comprehensive theological system, emphasizing God's sovereignty even over the fall itself, which occurred within divine providence, though God is not the author of sin. Reformation theology also recovered Paul's emphasis on justification by faith alone, not by works. Since the fall has so corrupted human nature that we cannot contribute to our salvation, redemption must be entirely God's work, received through faith as pure gift. This shifted focus from human moral effort to divine grace, from human merit to Christ's merit imputed to believers. John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1607, offered the most influential literary treatment of Eden. Milton imagined the fall in epic scope, giving Satan motivation and grandeur, showing Eve's reasoning process, depicting Adam's choice to fall with Eve rather than remain in paradise without her. The mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Milton's Satan is rebellious, proud, defiant, and through him Milton explores the nature of evil, freedom, and responsibility. Milton's Eve is curious, intellectually ambitious, yearning for growth and knowledge. Her fall is tragic rather than simply evil. She is deceived, but she is also reaching for something noble. Milton's Adam falls through love, choosing exile with Eve over paradise without her. How can I live without thee? How forego thy sweet converse and love so dearly joined? The poem complicates the simple blame assigned in traditional interpretation, showing both characters as complex, sympathetic, genuinely wrestling with impossible choices. Enlightenment thinkers began to question the entire framework. Voltaire satirized the doctrine of original sin. Rousseau argued that humans are naturally good, corrupted by civilization rather than by inherited sin. The fall became not theological truth, but mythological expression of humanity's troubled relationship with nature, society, and itself. Modern biblical scholarship, using historical critical methods, read Genesis as ancient Near Eastern literature, shaped by its cultural context, edited over centuries, reflecting the theological concerns of post-exilic Judaism rather than providing scientifically accurate history. This didn't necessarily eliminate theological meaning, but it complicated simplistic readings that treated Genesis as straightforward factual account. Yet the story persists. It has been rewritten, but not discarded, questioned but not forgotten. Each era finds in Eden something essential about human nature: our capacity for both greatness and failure, our freedom and its consequences, our longing for innocence and our inability to reclaim it. The fall remains the West's dominant myth of origins, shaping even secular understanding of human nature, guilt, redemption, and hope. For most of interpretive history, Eve bore primary blame for the fall. She was the first to eat, the first to be tempted, the one who then gave fruit to Adam. Church fathers often depicted her as weak, vain, sexually seductive, intellectually inferior, the entrance through which sin came into the world. Women in general were associated with Eve's failing, and her punishment, pain in childbirth, subordination to her husband, was understood as just, as reflecting women's lesser status in the created order. Tertullian, a 2nd century church father, wrote, "You are the devil's gateway. Because of your desert punishment, that is, death, even the Son of God had to die." Augustine spoke of women as needing the authority of men to complete the image of God. Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, suggested women were defective and misbegotten males. The theological tradition for centuries saw women through the lens of Eve's transgression. The association of women with Eve had devastating practical consequences. Women were excluded from church leadership, from education, from legal rights, from economic independence. Their testimony was considered less reliable. Their sexuality was seen as dangerous, tempting men towards sin. The virgin-whore dichotomy, woman as either pure Mary or fallen Eve, shaped how the women were perceived and controlled. But there have always been alternative readings. Some early Christian women found voice and authority through religious life, through mystical experience, through claiming direct divine revelation that transcended male ecclesiastical authority. Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, women mystics who refused to accept that their gender limited their access to God or their ability to teach spiritual truth. The Gnostic texts discovered at Nag Hammadi in 945 offered dramatically different readings of Eden. In the Apocryphon of John, the serpent is a hero, sent by the divine Sophia to awaken humanity from the ignorance imposed by the false creator god, the Demiurge. In the hypostasis of the Archons, Eve brings knowledge and life, outwitting the Archons, rulers, who want to keep humanity enslaved. These texts, suppressed by early Orthodox Christianity, portrayed Eve as enlightener rather than temptress, a seeker of wisdom rather than source of sin. Modern feminist theology has reclaimed Eve, reading her story with empathy and attention to power dynamics. Feminist scholars note that the Genesis text itself distributes responsibility evenly. Both Adam and Eve chose to eat, both face consequences. The harsher blame of Eve comes from interpretive tradition, not from scripture itself. Phyllis Tribble's groundbreaking work God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality in 1978 offered careful literary analysis of Genesis 2-3. She argued that traditional readings imposed patriarchal assumptions onto a text that is more egalitarian than usually acknowledged. Eve is created not as inferior helper, but as necessary partner. The Hebrew Ezer implies strength, not subordination. God is called Israel's Ezer in Psalms. Eve engages in sophisticated theological reasoning with the serpent, showing intellectual capability and moral agency. Adam, by contrast, is passive, silent, then quick to blame. Feminist interpreters see Eve's desire for wisdom as admirable rather than condemnable. She wants knowledge, understanding, growth. These are good desires. The tragedy is not that she wanted wisdom, but that she sought it through disobedience, through crossing boundaries, through suspicion of divine goodness. But her aspiration itself is noble, reflecting the best of human nature. The drive to learn, to question, to transcend given limitations. Some feminist readings go further, suggesting Eve's act was necessary for human development. To remain in Eden would have meant perpetual childhood, endless innocence without growth, existence without moral choice or historical development. Eve's fall was actually a fall upward, a painful but essential step into full humanity, into consciousness, into the capacity for authentic moral life. Without the fall, there would be no history, no civilization, no art or science or ethics. Eve enabled humanity to become truly human. This reading resonates with some strands of Jewish thought. Kabbalistic tradition sometimes portrays the fall as a necessary stage in cosmic evolution, as the descent required for eventual ascent. The breaking of vessels, the scattering of divine sparks, the mixture of good and evil, these are not simply catastrophes but processes through which ultimate redemption becomes possible. Womanist theology, emerging from African American women's experience, has also engaged the Eve story. Womanist scholars note that enslaved African American women were often sexually exploited with justification drawn from Eve's supposedly seductive nature. But they also found in Eve's story resonance with their own, knowledge gained through suffering, strength demonstrated through survival, resistance to oppressive authority even at great cost. Contemporary biblical scholar Elaine Pagels in Adam, Eve and the Serpent, 1988, traced how early Christianity's interpretation of Genesis shaped attitudes towards sexuality, gender, and free will. She showed how Augustine's reading, emerging from his own struggles with sexuality, projected onto Eve and Adam a cosmic drama of lust and will that subsequent Western culture inherited. Alternative early Christian readings that saw the fall differently were suppressed, lost, forgotten. Reclaiming Eve means reading her as subject rather than object, as agent rather than merely acted upon. It means recognizing her theological reasoning, her partnership with Adam, her role as mother of all living, a title that reverberates with life-giving significance. It means seeing her punishment not as prescription for all time, but as description of what will happen in a fallen world, a pattern to be resisted rather than enforced. The Gnostic texts make explicit what might be implicit in Genesis itself. Knowledge is not evil, wisdom is not sin, and the serpent's promise of opened eyes and divine likeness was not entirely false. These were good things, pursued through wrong means. The tragedy is not enlightenment but disobedience, not knowledge but the path to knowledge through boundary violation. If we read Eve empathetically, we see someone faced with impossible choice, torn between competing goods, manipulated by a deceptive voice, trying to make sense of limited information. We see someone who takes initiative, who reasons, who chooses, even if the choice is disastrous. We see the first philosopher, the first questioner, the first human to wonder whether things might be different than they are. And we see the first mother, whose labour pains are now read not simply as punishment but as participation in the ongoing work of creation. Every birth is both fall and redemption, pain that brings forth life, mortality that generates continuity, death leading to renewal. Eve's curse is also her dignity. Through her, despite everything, humanity continues. The rehabilitation of Eve is not complete, not universally accepted. Traditional interpretations still shape much religious teaching and practice, but increasingly interpreters recognize that the story of Eden is our story. Men and women together, both complicit in transgression, both bearing consequences, both needing redemption. If Adam represents humanity, so does Eve. If Adam's fall is our fall, so is Eve's. And if Christ redeems Adam, he redeems Eve too, indeed, redeems all of us who are children of both, heirs of both blessing and curse, called to move beyond the old binary towards something new. The story continues to be rewritten. Each generation brings new questions, new contexts, new liberations needed. Eve stands at the beginning, the first woman, the mother of all living, the one who reached for wisdom and found knowledge, who chose partnership over paradise, who walked into exile rather than remain in false innocence. She is our mother, our mirror, our warning and our hope. The Bible begins in a garden and ends in a garden. This is not coincidence but design, intentional structure showing the arc of sacred history as a great circle. From paradise lost to paradise restored, from exile to return, from fall to redemption. The Book of Revelation, the final book of the Christian Bible, draws extensively on Eden imagery. Chapter 22 describes the New Jerusalem descending from heaven. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also, on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. The tree of life returns, the river flows again, but now the tree of life is not singular but accessible on both sides of the river. It bears fruit continuously, abundantly, not just one harvest, but 12 each year, representing fullness, completeness, perpetual provision. And its leaves bring healing, not just for individuals, but for nations, for the collective human communities that have been wounded by history, divided by conflict, scarred by violence. The curse is lifted. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. The broken relationship is restored. The hiding is over. The exile ends. Humanity can see God's face, the very thing forbidden since the fall, the very vision that would mean death for Moses. In the restored paradise, the mediation is no longer necessary. The veil is gone. The cherubim no longer guard. The flaming sword is extinguished. This is eschatological vision, end times, final fulfillment, ultimate consummation. The garden returns not as restoration of what was, but as transformation into what will be. The New Jerusalem is both garden and city, combining the two great human endeavours, the cultivation of nature and the construction of civilization. It suggests that human history, with all its struggle and achievement, is not simply erased, but redeemed, incorporated into the final paradise. The tree in the midst of the city is striking imagery. Cities are usually seen as opposite of gardens, places of concrete and steel, pollution and noise, separation from nature, but the eschatological vision unites them. The city becomes garden. The urban and the natural are reconciled. Human culture and divine creation exist in harmony rather than tension. This suggests that the goal is not simply return to Eden, but movement beyond Eden to something greater. Adam and Eve in the garden were innocent but also naive, given only one prohibition, facing only one test. Humanity in the New Jerusalem has passed through all of history, has known good and evil, experienced fall and redemption, built civilizations and destroyed them, learned through suffering and grown through trial. The restored paradise is not prelapsarian innocence, but post-lapsarian wisdom, not ignorance recovered, but innocence regained through transformation. Christian theology speaks of this as the felix culpa, the happy fault, the necessary fall. In the Easter liturgy, the Exulter sings, "O happy fault, O necessary sin of Adam, which gained for us so great a Redeemer." The suggestion is that the fall, while tragic, enabled something greater than would have existed without it. Through Christ's incarnation, death and resurrection, humanity is not merely restored but elevated, brought into even deeper union with God than Adam knew. This idea troubles some theologians. Does it mean God planned the fall? Does it diminish the seriousness of sin? Does it make God manipulative, allowing evil for supposedly greater good? These questions have generated enormous debate. Eastern Orthodox theology tends to reject the felix culpa concept, while some Western theology embraces it. What seems clear in Revelation is that history moves forward, not backward. The end is not identical to the beginning. Time is not simply circular but spirals, returning to the garden but on a higher level, incorporating all that has been learned and suffered and achieved. The tree is the same tree, but its fruit is for nations, not just two individuals. The river is the same river, but it flows through a city, not pristine wilderness. Paradise 2.0 is paradise that has digested history, that includes rather than excludes human development. The vision also addresses mortality. Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. The curse pronounced in Genesis 3, pain, toil, death, is reversed. But notice, this happens not through returning to prelapsarian Eden, but through eschatological transformation. The way forward is through, not around. The resurrection does not bypass death, but passes through death to life beyond. The apocalyptic literature of Judaism and Christianity consistently portrays the end times as a recovery of Eden. Isaiah 11 describes the peaceable kingdom. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. This echoes Eden's harmony between humans and animals, predator and prey dwelling together without violence. Ezekiel's vision of the restored temple includes a river flowing from the sanctuary, making fresh water where there was salt, bringing life where there was death. Trees grow along its banks bearing fruit each month, their leaves for healing, imagery. Revelation draws on directly. The prophetic vision sees temple, garden, city and river united in the restored order. The Psalms express longing for this restoration. Psalm 23. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Psalm 36. How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. These images of garden, water, abundance, light, all evoke Eden, suggest its recovery. But the biblical vision is not just individual salvation. It is cosmic redemption. Romans 8 speaks of the whole creation groaning in labor pains, waiting for liberation from bondage to corruption. The redemption of humanity means redemption of creation itself. The earth that was cursed because of Adam's sin will be liberated, renewed, transformed. Paradise will not be escape from earth to heaven, but transformation of earth into Eden, or beyond Eden into the New Jerusalem. This has ecological implications. If creation itself is to be redeemed, not disrupted, then care for the environment is not mere pragmatism but theological commitment. The earth is not disposable, not simply temporary stage for human drama. It is the beloved creation, marred by fall but destined for renewal. How we treat the earth reflects our understanding of God's purposes. The apocalyptic vision also has political implications. The healing of nations, the removal of curse, the dwelling of God with humanity. These suggest transformed social relations, justice and peace as permanent reality rather than fleeting achievement. The city of God includes the nations bringing their glory into it, suggests reconciliation and diversity rather than uniformity. The journey from Genesis to Revelation is humanity's journey, from garden to exile, through wilderness and empire and conquest and captivity, through law and prophecy and wisdom and poetry, to incarnation and resurrection, and finally to restoration and glorification. The whole biblical narrative is framed by these two gardens, these two trees, these two rivers. Everything between is the long, painful, beautiful, tragic, redemptive story of how we lost paradise and how paradise might be regained, or rather, how we might become fit for paradise, how we might be transformed into beings capable of dwelling in the divine presence without fear or shame. The gate closed in Genesis 3. The gate opens in Revelation 21:22. The cherubim lower their swords. The exile ends. The long journey home is complete. But we are not there yet. We stand between the gardens, in the wilderness of history, carrying memory of what was and hope for what will be. We build our temporary gardens, tell our stories, plant our seeds. We wait and work and pray, "Come, Lord Jesus." The longing for paradise is not unique to Hebrew and Christian tradition. Across cultures and millennia, humans have dreamed of a golden age, a perfect beginning, a harmonious realm from which we have fallen or been exiled. These stories are remarkably similar in their basic structure while reflecting the distinct concerns and values of each civilization. The Persian tradition spoke of Paradisa, the walled garden, the royal park, the enclosed paradise. This is the origin of the English word paradise, entering Greek and then Latin from Persian sources. Persian gardens were marvels of engineering: water channels, fruit trees, flowering plants, carefully designed to create an oasis of beauty and abundance within hostile desert environments. The garden represented human mastery over nature, divine favour manifested in fertility, the power of kings to command even the wilderness to bloom. The Quranic descriptions of paradise draw on this Persian imagery: rivers flowing with wine and honey, lush vegetation, cool shade, eternal springs. Hindu cosmology describes the Satya Yuga or Krita Yuga, the golden age at the beginning of the cycle of time. In this era, Dharma, cosmic order, was fully present. Humans lived for thousands of years, possessed supernatural abilities, knew no violence or disease. Truth, compassion, and righteousness were natural and universal. There was no need for temples or scriptures, because divine knowledge was self-evident. No one had to work. The earth provided abundantly without cultivation. This was paradise not as garden, but as state of consciousness, as alignment with ultimate reality. As the cosmic cycle turns through silver, bronze, and iron ages, Dharma progressively diminishes. We currently live in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and corruption, when human lifespans are shortest, when violence and ignorance prevail, when spiritual knowledge requires strenuous effort, but the cycle will eventually complete, and a new golden age will dawn. Hindu tradition thus sees paradise as both past and future, lost and yet to come, accessible through spiritual practice that aligns individual consciousness with eternal truth. Buddhist tradition speaks less of a historical golden age than of the Pure Land, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism. The Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha is described with paradisiacal imagery: jeweled trees, lotus ponds, celestial music, constant teaching of Dharma. But Pure Land is understood as both place and state of mind, both future destination and present possibility. Through devotion and practice, one can be reborn in the Pure Land where conditions are perfect for achieving enlightenment. Alternatively, one can realize that all lands are pure when seen with awakened eyes. Paradise is not somewhere else but here, obscured only by delusion. Chinese tradition has the Garden of the Immortals, home of the 8 immortals, where peaches of immortality grow on trees that bloom once every 3,000 years. This paradise is not primordial origin, but ultimate achievement, a realm attained by those who perfect themselves through Taoist practice. It represents transcendence of mortality, harmony with the Tao, the fruition of alchemical work both physical and spiritual. Mayan cosmology described Paxil and Kaela, the mountains of sustenance where the first humans were formed from maize dough. The gods needed multiple attempts to create humans, first from mud, too soft, then wood too rigid, finally from corn just right. The realm of Paxil represented abundance, perfect food, the source of life itself. When the gods finally got humanity right, they celebrated in this paradise of maize, mountains, and cacao trees. The indigenous peoples of North America have countless variations on paradise traditions. Many speak of a time when humans and animals communicated directly, when all beings lived in balance, when the earth provided without scarcity. These traditions often locate paradise not in distant past, but in potential present, available through right relationship, through following traditional ways, through ceremonies that restore harmony. Paradise is not lost irrevocably, but damaged, and humans have responsibility to maintain or restore balance. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime is complex and defies simple paradise interpretation. It is not exactly past, but perpetually present, not linear history, but mythic reality underlying the physical world. The ancestral beings of Dreamtime shaped the landscape and established law. To walk in Dreamtime is to participate in this foundational reality, to connect with the eternal patterns that give meaning to existence. This is not Eden, as garden from which we are exiled, but continuing presence available through song, story, ceremony. Greek tradition had the Golden Age described by Hesiod, a time when humans lived like gods, free from toil and grief, when the earth bore fruit abundantly without labour, when people died peacefully like falling asleep. This was followed by Silver, Bronze, and Iron Ages, each more violent and difficult than the last. But there was also the Elysian Fields, paradise for heroes after death, located at the western edge of the world, where neither snow nor rain fell, where gentle ocean breezes provided perfect climate. Norse mythology spoke of Asgard, home of the gods, and the well Urdabrunna beneath Yggdrasil, the world tree. This was not exactly paradise, but source and centre, where the Norns determined fate, where the roots of all existence drew sustenance. The Norse vision was less utopian than many. It anticipated Ragnarok, the end of the gods and destruction of the world. But even after Ragnarok, a new world would emerge, green and fertile, where survivors would begin again. What do all these traditions share? First, the recognition that something is wrong with current existence. Suffering, mortality, scarcity, conflict, these are not simply givens, but departures from a better condition. Second, the location of perfection, either in distant past or distant future, or in some cases both. Paradise exists at the temporal edges, bracketing the fallen present. Third, the association of paradise with abundance, harmony, divine presence, and lack of death. These are the universal human longings: enough food, peace, meaning, continued existence. Fourth, the connection between paradise and knowledge or consciousness. Whether it's Dharma, awakening, the names of things, or moral awareness, paradise involves a kind of knowing that current humans lack or have corrupted. These parallels suggest several possibilities. Perhaps all cultures have inherited fragments of a single original tradition, the memory of an actual historical paradise scattered and distorted across migrations and millennia. This is the view of some religious conservatives. Perhaps these stories reflect universal human psychology, the longing for perfection, the tendency to locate it in inaccessible past or future, the need to explain present suffering. This is the view of most psychologists and anthropologists. Perhaps they point to spiritual reality that transcends culture, genuine if obscured human memory of our origin in and destiny toward divine life. This is the view of perennialist philosophy. The differences are also instructive. Hebrew Eden is explicitly about moral knowledge and divine command. Greek Golden Age emphasizes labor and toil. Hindu Satya Yuga focuses on consciousness and dharma. Persian Paradise highlights order and beauty. Each paradise reflects the particular concerns and values of its culture, what they see as most important, what they understand as most lacking. The comparative study of paradise traditions reveals both the diversity of human imagination and the commonality of human longing. We tell ourselves stories of perfection lost because we recognize imperfection present. We dream of gardens because we experience wilderness. We remember harmony because we endure conflict. We imagine immortality because we face death. Paradise is the negative space of our positive experience. What is not but should be, what was but is no longer, what might be if only. Eden is humanity's story, but it is also every human's story. Each culture writes its own version, encodes its own values, projects its own hopes. But underneath the variety, the common theme persists. We were meant for more than this. Somewhere, somehow, we lost the way. The question is whether and how we might find it again, whether the gardens we build today can approximate the garden we remember or anticipate the garden we await. We stand at the end of our investigation, having traced the Garden of Eden from Mesopotamian temples to biblical text, from historical geography to mystical interiority, from early Christian theology to modern feminist reclamation. We have seen how one story has been told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, used and misused across millennia and cultures. Yet the story persists. Eden remains humanity's most enduring image of both origin and destination, of what we were and what we might become. Modern resonances of Eden are everywhere if we know how to look. Environmental movements speak of pristine wilderness, of ecosystems in balance and of restoring nature to some imagined original state. This is ecological Eden, the belief that nature without human interference is paradise, that our task is preservation or restoration of primal harmony. The language of conservation is often explicitly paradisiacal. Virgin forest, unspoiled wilderness, places where humans have not yet fallen into destructive relationship with the earth. But this vision is itself complicated. Indigenous peoples have long noted that the pristine wilderness celebrated by Western environmentalism is often land from which native inhabitants were removed, either through genocide or forced relocation. The Eden of environmentalism sometimes requires human absence, which itself is a kind of exile. True environmental ethics may require not retreat from nature but transformed engagement, not absence but different presence. Perhaps more like Adam's original task to work and keep the garden, to tend rather than exploit, to participate rather than dominate or abandon. Genetic science speaks of the first human, the mitochondrial Eve from whom all living humans descend. Scientific and religious narratives converge and diverge around this figure. The genetic evidence points to a single female ancestor, though not a literal first woman created de novo, but the survivor of a population bottleneck, the one whose line persisted while others did not. This scientific Eve lived roughly 50,000 pounds 200,000 years ago, vastly earlier than any biblical chronology. But the parallel is striking. Our origin in a single mother, our common descent, our fundamental human unity beneath all surface diversity. Digital culture creates virtual Edens, online worlds, games, simulations where users can craft perfect environments, where death is temporary and resources infinite, where one can start over endlessly. The appeal of such spaces echoes the paradise longing. We want worlds we can control, where consequences are limited, where existence is frictionless. But these artificial paradises also reveal the limits of such control. Without risk, there is no meaning. Without real consequences, choices become trivial. Without mortality, nothing matters. The virtual gardens, however beautiful, cannot satisfy the deep human need for something beyond ourselves, something resistant to our will, something genuinely other. The quest for life extension and even immortality has intensified with biotechnology. If we could hack mortality, could we regain access to the tree of life through scientific rather than spiritual means? The Silicon Prophets promise radical life extension, consciousness upload, technological transcendence. This is Eden through engineering rebuilding paradise, not by divine grace but by human ingenuity. But the questions remain. Even if we could extend life indefinitely, would we thereby solve the deeper problem of meaning, purpose, relationship? Is the issue merely biological or fundamentally existential? Paradise has also become political metaphor. Utopian movements across the spectrum promise paradise regained through proper social organization. Communist paradise where private property is abolished and resources shared. Libertarian paradise where markets are freed from regulation. Nationalist paradise where ethnic homogeneity is restored. Progressive paradise where all hierarchies are dismantled. Each political ideology contains implicit or explicit Edenic vision, a picture of how things should be, a blueprint for society that would eliminate the ills we currently experience. The danger, as the 20th century demonstrated with horrifying clarity, is that attempting to force paradise into existence through political power often creates hell instead. Yet the longing is not illegitimate. The hunger for justice, for peace, for a world where no one is oppressed or hungry or forgotten, this is itself an echo of paradise, a refusal to accept the fallen world as final. The prophetic tradition, both religious and secular, insists that what is need not be, that transformation is possible, that history can bend towards something better. The danger lies not in the vision, but in absolutizing it, in believing one group possesses complete knowledge of what paradise requires and has authority to impose it by force. Philosophically, Eden represents the fundamental tension in human self-understanding. Are we fallen angels or risen apes? Do we look backward to a golden age or forward to progressive improvement? Is our trajectory one of decline from perfection or ascent from savagery? The Eden story suggests we are both, created good but corrupted, bearing divine image but marred by sin, capable of great nobility and terrible evil, oriented toward transcendence yet bound to earth. The existential philosophers explored the human condition of being thrown into existence, conscious of mortality, burdened with freedom. Sartre's existence precedes essence is in some ways anti-Edenic. There is no original design, no created nature, only the making of ourselves through choices. Camus's absurd hero Sisyphus must imagine himself happy despite endless meaningless toil, a direct inversion of Eden's easy abundance. These philosophies try to live without paradise, to accept the world as it is without reference to how it should have been. Yet the fact that they must argue against Eden's pull shows its continuing power. The memory of paradise functions psychologically as well as theologically. Developmentally, many psychologists note that childhood, particularly early childhood, often carries paradisiacal qualities in memory. The child experiences the world as given, parents as omnipotent providers, needs as automatically met. The developmental fall comes with growing awareness of self and other, with recognition of separateness, with understanding of mortality and limit. Growing up is leaving Eden. Maturity is learning to live in exile, to accept limits, to work for sustenance that is no longer simply provided. But the psychological Eden remains accessible in certain experiences: romantic love, peak experiences, flow states, moments when self-consciousness briefly dissolves and we taste unity again. Perhaps Eden never ended. Perhaps it was never a place at all but a state of consciousness, a way of being in the world that remains theoretically available even if rarely achieved. Perhaps the fall was not historical event but perpetual present. We fall constantly, every time we choose self over other, control over trust, fear over love. And perhaps redemption is equally present, available any moment we choose differently, open ourselves differently, see differently. The flaming sword at Eden's gate might represent not divine punishment, but the impossibility of going backward. We cannot return to innocence once we have become conscious. We cannot unknow what we have learned. We cannot rebuild the garden of childhood or the harmony of ignorance. The way back is barred. But perhaps the cherubim are not only guards, but guides. Perhaps the sword burns away what must be burned, the false self, the illusions, the attachments that keep us trapped in endless repetition. Perhaps passing through the fire is the only way to reach the tree. Perhaps death and resurrection, letting go and receiving, exile and return are not sequential, but simultaneous, not historical but eternal. This is the investigation's end. Eden is both history and symbol, both past event and present reality, both memory and hope. It is the story we tell about ourselves to make sense of the gap between what is and what should be, between our experience of life and our intuition that life could be otherwise. It is humanity's primal scene, our collective dream of origin, our shared vocabulary for discussing innocence and guilt, harmony and division, paradise and exile. The garden waits, or perhaps more accurately we wait, hoping the garden waits. We plant our seeds in difficult ground, water with sweat and tears, harvest what we can. We build our cities and cathedrals, write our poems and prayers, create our art and science. We reach toward transcendence through whatever means our age and culture provide. We remember, dimly or clearly, something beautiful that was lost, and we hope, tentatively or boldly, that what was lost might somehow be restored, or that something even better might yet be created from the ruins of the first garden. Perhaps Eden was the first word we wrote when we learned to remember. Perhaps it is the last word we will speak when we finally learn to return. Or perhaps Eden is the silence between words, the space between breaths, the rest between labours, always present, rarely noticed, waiting to be recognized. The gate is closed. The gate is open. We are exiled. We are home. The garden was lost. The garden remains. These contradictions resolve not in logic but in living, not in understanding but in becoming, not in possessing but in being possessed by the vision of what we were created to be and might yet become. The investigation concludes. The story continues. We turn from the ancient text back to the present moment, carrying its images and questions with us. The garden grows in us even as we are expelled from it. The tree stands at the centre, always forbidden and always beckoning. The river flows whether we see it or not. And somewhere in the east, at the edge of memory and hope, the cherubim stand watch, their swords still flaming, their vigil still unbroken, guarding and perhaps, when the time comes, welcoming us home.